you have both of those. Your notion, I think, coexistence theory, right, is that both of those like exist in parallel. And I believe in the video you made for the theories of everything competition, you
Mm.
talk a little bit about the necessity of introducing consciousness as a way of mediating between the two, um, as a way of, I guess I think you call it paradoxical awareness of the parallel, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
and what that makes me wonder about your framework is whether then consciousness would be seen as, I guess, a fundamental in your view, or as something that, because if it's being invoked to sort of explain the conjunction in that coexistence, holding those two things together, is it then over and above? Like, how do you, I guess, how do you think of consciousness? And also, what's your attitude about idealism as a metaphysical thesis?
So uh, I view paradoxism as a transcendental um, philosophy, meaning that yeah, it would fall under the category of idealism. And but what it does is it doesn't claim truth as an absolute insofar as it can be spoken. It's more of a pathway to experience of truth. So you know, when it comes to consciousness, it is axiomatic insofar as you know when I say you, I really mean in general, and it was really my path. But when you go down or when you climb the ladder of paradoxism, it only leads you up to a certain point. Hopefully, it will lead to the experience of the paradox or of that conscious awareness of the paradox at play, so that you can understand that in fact there is no distinction between consciousness and physics matter. That there's no distinctions whatsoever. There's an absolute pervasiveness, the Parmenidean sort of description of the
Mystical
worlds.
one.
Yes, there you go.
It
Interesting.
almost sounds like a kind of Eastern spiritual Zen koan or something to kind of set the mind at a certain state to realize something. Is that
Yes, that's exactly it. But for brainiacs like us, for people who can't accept reality without rigorous logical search, and yeah, so not for most people, I wouldn't say. No. It just confuses most people. Like, what is this? Uh,
Yeah.
that can be a pathway? Maybe confusion could be a pathway to
yeah,
realizing oneness.
that's true. Good point. Good point. Yeah.
So I remember last time we talked, something that you said a few times was that nothingness must exist in some respect in order for it to make sense to invoke it as a concept, right? And I'm thinking to myself, like, I guess what does that mean? In what respect, in your mind, does nothingness exist? And um, is it I guess one way of thinking about it would be as a relative counterpart or opposite to existence. But another way is as, I guess, or I suppose one way of thinking about it is a relative opposite and counterpart in the ontological sense. And then another way would be a relative opposite and counterpart in the conceptual sense, namely that, the concept of everything or something or existence would seem to demand, like, as by way of a definition, right? That some opposite or some other. I guess what I'm wondering is, to you, does it seem like when you say that it has to exist in some respect in order to be invoked? How do you conceive of the nature of that existence that it has?
Well, so I'm gonna hold myself. Well, I'm gonna hold my own feet to the fire. I'm gonna say void from now on, just so we know what we're all talking about. So, to me, I think void exists in some capacity, and whether that is logically or physically proved, I think is besides the point. I think it's necessary as an exercise for consciousness to be able to understand that, in fact, there is no distinction, or to achieve that transcendental um, or existential feeling of oneness, that meaning, that sort of higher state. So that contextualizing everything. I don't want to lose my train of thought there because you ask very sophisticated and precise questions, Matthew, and so I have to focus. Can you reiterate that again?
Yeah, the question was whether you conceive of. I actually think you already answered it, but the question was whether you conceive of the way in which that nothingness would have to exist in order to be invoked as being a conceptual necessity or an ontological necessity. And I think the answer that I heard you give was something like, if it exists conceptually as a necessary aspect, then it
Right.
exists ontologically because you don't distinguish ultimately between something. I guess if something exists conceptually and consciousness is identical with the mystical one, then
Yeah.
obviously the ontology is going to just be one to one with that.
And so this is where the idea of infinite regress enters into play, because it's both. It's both that they are equivocal or there's no distinction, and that they have their own identity necessarily. So um, to me, that's what I mean by infinite regress of paradoxes as well. So there's the infinite regress of infinite regress squared. That's what I call it. Is that what you just asked, like question, falls into another paradox that both is the case. Um, it is the case that to me that it is that void exists conceptually as a necessity to achieve that transcendental awareness and experience of truth as one discrete unit, and it then but then one it's after the fact that you realize there is no distinction once you've had that experience, but the idea that it took you two components that are have their own identity uh, shows you that they're in fact they are discrete and different, and that one is a concept and whereas the other is an ontological um, void in a way because it doesn't exist. It's an ontological object that doesn't exist. So so it's always both is the answer for me. It's always a paradox. So I guess the Heraclitus is where, like, insofar as you see Parmenides having his counterpart being Heraclitus, I would I'm siding on Heraclitus' side. Is my answer, I guess, in another resumed way.
Hmm. I notice that you're making the explicit distinction between nothingness and void. Can you explain that a bit more?
That I'm making the explicit difference between the two
Yeah, like what? Why are you making that difference now?
because, well, like I said, I think what what Matthew was saying about there being a necessity to have a distinction between ontological commitments and an epistemological statement is necessary. If we're going to talk amongst each other, it's necessary, uh, and it's necessary in order to achieve, like, to go up that ladder. Once you have had the experience, to me, I think it no longer matters, and I think that's what I hadn't understood. That hey, you can't, like, the whole point, and I didn't even know what I was doing, right? Like I wasn't trying to create a, a philosophy for everybody else. The point was to test my ideas against other people to be able to prove the philosophy to myself. So hey, if other people, if it works with others, then I can validate it for myself. There seems to be this important um, desire or requirement to human beings, maybe at least for me, that 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 goes with this idea that you're intrinsically linked with the external world, with other consciousnesses, and that your ideas, in order to be able to integrate them properly, they have to function in relation to everybody else. So I do make that distinction now, and I make it because that is how I viewed the world. That there was a difference between void and nothingness, or that there wasn't before. To me, I thought they were the same thing because I was just not sophisticated enough, and I didn't really look at the physics enough, and I didn't understand how relativity fits in, and so on. And then I discovered the aletheia, the idea that an object can exist in the same point in space and time, and that is impossible in physics. But the interesting thing was that when I applied that idea to existence itself, when we're talking about existence, um, does it exist in the same point and space and time? I mean, yes, if you think about it, because it exists in all spaces and all times. It exists. So the question is, um, what does it expand into, or what does it exist within, or what does it emerge, from where does it emerge? When you ask those physical questions, you realize, well, then non-existence has to exist in some fashion, or that's at least how I got started from the physical standpoint. And then it was sufficient to me that, well, whether we infinitely or infinitely prove and discover new constructs that are physical or existential to go on to prove to ourselves after a while, okay, there is no such thing as void. It doesn't really matter, because you can get there through consciousness, and that consciousness, the experience of void to me is it's kind of like someone going on a crazy trip, right? And just being like, whoa, I just saw the void, enter the void kind of stuff. It's kind of ironic that the most existential you'll feel, the more existential you feel, the more surreal everything feels. And if surreal, to me, the experience of surrealism, if that's not nothingness or void, I should say, I don't know what is, but it's somehow the more that we kind of align ourselves with existence in the most pure fashion, the way language can't, right? Like language, I'm a firm believer now, cannot map the territory, but you can become the territory. That's what consciousness does. I think that's what's special about us as human beings, is we can tap into becoming or being the territory, and that shows you that nothingness and existence, or void and existence, coexist or are the same thing, or there's no, it's not, it doesn't even make sense to say everything that I'm saying right now, as all of that becomes irrelevant. The point is, can we find some kind of the closest description to that? And that's what paradoxism is to me.
It also reminds me of like when in Eastern religions they say oneness. It's it's everything and it's infinite, but in some sense it's also nothing, but not in a absolute sense, as in it's still everything, even though it's a nothing.
It kind of reminds me of the Tao, nothingness in the sense of no particular thingness, right? Not so much as the absence of things, but more as that oneness, the presence of the one. And what James said about after having a personal mystical experience of the one, that that a lot of these distinctions cease to be significant, and you kind of throw them away. That reminds me of what Wittgenstein says in the Tractatus about when you have finally worked your way through the system and understood me, you'll throw it all away like a ladder you've climbed up out of. And then it'll be then he concludes with that final statement, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one ought to remain silent.
Yeah, well, that's the Tao all the way. I think one of the first stanzas is the way that is named the way is not the way. But like, to me, when we're using language, we're making distinctions, we're creating contrasts. So to me, if we're going to have a philosophical debate about the nature of reality, it makes no sense to throw away the other component that would help you make that contrast, so that you can go and hook into the understanding of that experience that we're trying to describe, that is indescribable. And that's why I hold on to this idea that void is an ontological and epistemological necessity, if truth is what you're after, not after to describe, but after to experience.
Some of this reminds me of a quote. It's actually quite an ancient quote from an unknown geometer. I'm curious to see how it lands with you. The quote is, "Existence is a sphere whose center is everywhere and whose boundary is nowhere."
Wow, I like that. It reminds me of, for some reason, it reminds me of what Graham Priest said. He said that a limit implies that which is beyond it. Because then the moment you start to think of points and spheres, you're going back into space-time, and you're thinking of things geometrically, of course. And that's the issue to begin with, is we're tied to the space-time construct. And if we're tied to that, then you've automatically precluded yourself from actually investigating what void is. So I like it as a physics example, because it gets very close to saying, hey, there's something strange with the physics here. And that there's something relative to consciousness that you have to think about. That idea is paradoxical when you think of what you just said. And so to me, that was the whole process of my philosophy, is to investigate that very paradox, or that experience that I had in my mind. Why, like, what is it? Is a paradox a lack of understanding, or is it in fact something that indicates a higher truth that I'm not understanding in some fashion? So when I heard Priest say that, that was brilliant, because that when he said a limit implies that which is beyond it, that's what I was explaining with my infinity limited idea in that video that I did. That the antinomy is a boundary between our perceptual limitations and our conceptual ability for grasping a priori truths. So to me, when someone says, "Oh, infinity, nothingness," no, that doesn't exist, because we can't, by definition, or it's unprovable or whatever. To me, it's kind of insane. Not insane, but it used to be frustrating. Now I'm not frustrated at all, but I'm still baffled by how we can accept certain a priori truths and others we don't. Like, it's so arbitrary to me. How can we accept that logic is a priori, but we can't accept nothingness or paradoxes as a priori? In fact, a priori literally means, from what I understand, that it is, you do not need to experience something to know that it's true. It is true intrinsically in some fashion. So, I mean, if there can be, and I really do think that it's an exception, a hierarchy of a priori truths, like which a priori truths are more a priori than others, which doesn't make sense because they're all a priori. But there seems to be an exception, and it's that nothingness. Nothingness is the most a priori you can get, because not only does it not require experience of it or empirical proof of it to know that it's true, it doesn't, it removes all contexts within which you need to experience anyway. A void is just, it's so a priori that it falls outside of a priori in a way. So and so we all accept this. I think most people walk around knowing, yeah, there's probably nothingness, and then God created out of nothing, right? Or the Big Bang. Prior to that, there was, but we don't understand it. We don't accept it in our physics and our sciences, which makes sense because the two are mutually exclusive to me. I don't think we're in the business of doing the same thing. I think philosophy and science, although they're trying to find a mutual agreement into understanding the fundamental nature of reality, aren't necessarily in the same business, because science is, to me, tied to the space-time construct, and that's it. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that it causes a lot of grief for no reason, and I think debates that are going in circles that aren't going anywhere. But maybe it is productive too. I mean, if we're trying to understand the consciousness from the side of the brain, that can be very useful for sciences and helping people in different ways. But understanding the brain from the point of view of consciousness is something we've already done thousands of years ago. It's what meditation's about. It's what a lot of our religious texts point to, and all of this stuff has been fleshed out long ago. I think that what we're all doing in this community is reinterpreting and getting more precise for our times, being as we know a lot more today about the world than the physical world than we used to.
Well, arguably, the rationalists were attempting to make a science of thought and with reason and logic, not focusing on empiricism. So kind of continuing, well, definitely standing on their shoulders. How successful we are in adding to that knowledge is questionable, but I'd like to think we're doing something good.
Yeah, well, so to me, data logical theory is so far the most up-to-date philosophical framework for what our sciences are trying to do, because everything is coming down to data and information. So we need to understand the relationship between the two, and continue down that path. So.
That's
Um,
Matthew's expertise there.
yeah, so like to me, I would say your theory is on the other side of my, like, your theory is from the physics standpoint, and mine would be more from the consciousness standpoint, is how I view it. And perhaps maybe it's both of our philosophies are observing the nature of reality from both sides. Um,
Complementary in a way.
they're complementary, exactly. It's just that I happen to be a bit more axed towards the consciousness side, and yours more towards the physics side. Um, Whatever that means, I don't know, but I do think that there's probably more of a necessity for your theory, insofar as it should be disseminated, than mine, because I don't think mine's really any different than, it's different based on an identitarian thing, but it's not different insofar as the value of what it has to say. I mean, it's been said in many different ways. Taoism, for example, being one of them. You know.
I think it's
And
quite a nice, it's quite a nice thing to do, to consider the requirements of a theory of everything, for example, and perhaps include this, not psychosomatic, what's the word I'm looking for? Psychoactive component of,
Mhm.
helping one recognize that nothingness from their consciousness or from experience.
yeah, I mean, it may be. This is one thing I like about what Peterson said at some point. He said that today we no longer have the psychic energy to be able to transform and integrate ourselves as individuals in society and as a culture. And so, because we have been reduced too much to material reductionism, um, or we've gone down that path too much. So he said that the only way out, or forward now, is psychology, is to be able to understand these things on a more rational level. Um, and so I think that he was right about that, and that, in that light, I would say, yeah, perhaps my theory, or I don't even want to call it a theory anymore, but my practice, or philosophy is can help in that way, because it is completely logical. Because it's like, how do you lead a horse to water, right, when it doesn't want to drink? Well, you can bring the water to the horse. It's really the only thing that you can do after. I think that's what a lot of science and philosophy is about today, is to try to return to, because we're seeing that in different ways. I just spent 6 months in Colombia, and seeing so many people from the West coming to have a spiritual experience, ayahuasca and all this stuff. It's clear that in the West we're trying to find that psychological integration again, or to be able to achieve the hero's journey, as Campbell would say it. And we're unable to do that because, yeah, we are so shaped around the hard sciences, um, that we just don't have the psychic energy to do anything else. So maybe we can do a more hard logical approach.
Well, I definitely see Matthew's model containing psychoactive elements too.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm also wondering whether, and this might be going a bit off topic, getting into data logic theory, but is data synonymous or in a kind of semantic difference with void in your mind, Matthew?
Void. I would think of data as being almost like an exact opposite to void. Data is like the non-contingent presence of determinate being, I suppose. Whereas I would think of void as either the supreme generalization of absence, or at the very least the presence of the most indeterminate kind of being that you could possibly have.
Mm, I like that. Um, I fully agree on that in every respect. It brought to mind that thing that, was it Hawking who said that, what breathes life into the equations,
Mm-hmm.
um, that's the question. Uh, do you see data as that life, or is it just the most fundamental substance or substrate of reality?
Probably more the most fundamental substance, but I would think of it as the seed of life, because it's as data. The way I would think about it is that it's as data complexifies in that data logical formation, there's layers in the data logical onion, so to speak, and the more complexity gets added to that equation, and the more you have the propensity for the emergence of life and animus and activity.
So this is where I'm curious about that infinitely regressive question. Like, where does that data come from?
Well, the nature of it is that it can't fail to be there. So it doesn't come from anywhere. It's like a light switch that, if you imagine that on is things existing and off is things not existing. It's like off just isn't there. There isn't a way to switch it down. So asking the question, how did it come to be switched on? It's like there isn't an alternative. So there's no need for it to come to be. It just it cannot fail to be, basically.
Yeah, that's the non-contingent aspect of it. Yeah. So it's an absolute.
Yes, it's an absolute, yes.
Yeah. And that's where it's interesting, right? Like, why is it that we have the capability to question the absolute? It's like, well, you either accept it or you don't, or you move on, right? Like, but we like to ask the question, where does it come from? How does it work? How can it be? And I think that's where the answer has to be experience it if you want to understand it. Don't ask that question. But if you're going to ask, or if you're going to try to understand the nature of reality for practical purposes or to extract some kind of utility, then you do need to conceptualize how things formalize themselves in the world. And I think data and logic, I love it because what it does is it creates a linchpin, or it creates a dovetail between the most abstract thing that you can get and the most concrete.
Mm-hmm.
And me being a guy of dualism, or playing with dualism and finding a way to connect them, that's a beautiful idea. Is that logic and data do have an intrinsic connection together. It makes sense. I think that's what distributes itself throughout all of reality. We see that in many ways, and I don't know what kind of utility it can lead to, but I think it's an important path forward.
Yeah, I think that the dual aspect monism is one area where we have a lot in common, very much on the same page as to, I think, the correct kind of reality theory, or however you want to label it, metaphysics, is going to be some variety of dual aspect monism. I think that that's the only way of accounting for difference and oppositions that naturally populate the entire world, while also maintaining the intuition that ultimately, there's a one. Everything is ultimately one existence. There's a unus mundus, as Jung would call it. But I'm curious because obviously we talked a little bit just now about like my concept of the absolute, and your lens on the absolute is as infinity, right? I'm thinking that's what the video kind of suggested. I guess I'm curious to know a bit more about that. Like, what exactly is infinity to you? How would you conceptualize and describe that?
So infinity to me is it's very close to, if not the same thing as, your absolute. So you to me, you could look at the infinite timeline as a timeline, let's say, and just one way. I'm just thinking out loud here, but I was thinking, it could be an alternation between data and logic. If you look at the line and it's infinite, but really, to me, the problem that we need to address, or the challenge that we need to address, that isn't being addressed by the more physics-based theories, is that we can question these things, and that when we do, and that's because we can question these things, that we're not able to unify on anything, and to understand. We all agree that's what I like what David said. He said that we all agree that 1 equals 1. The question is, does 0 equal 1? And for the Parmenidean side, they say, well, there can be no, there's the law of the excluded middle. It's in our direct experience. It can't get any more clear. And so if it's already one, then by extension, zero cannot be. And therefore, it's just not a question to ask.
Mm-hmm.
And yet there's so many people that do ask the question. There's so many people who do say, no, in fact, zero does equal one, or one does equal zero, or that they're indistinguishable from each other. So and even in the maths, I mean, you got Ramanujan, right, with his division by zero. So you can't just do away with that and say, yeah, well, you guys are wrong because it's stuck at one, and we know like we have to deal with that. Now, how I deal with it is to try to create that connection between, say, data logical theory and that idea that zero equals one, and the infinite to me is that it is the idea or the concept that can bind them together, because it is a duality, or it is a monistic force composed of duality. I mean, if you think of infinity as a line, once again, and it's a sequence, right? You have a sequence of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you have discrete units, and in between those units, you can infinitely, decompose them, of course. And yet, because infinity itself has no beginning or end, and that in between any two units on that line, there's an infinite amount of points and units and so on, that you realize there's an intrinsic connection between void and the existential world, then it transcends both of them or binds both of them together. And that's the only concept really, or the best concept as far as I'm aware, that can allow us to realize or to come to an agreement and to stop having that discussion of like whether God created the universe out of nothing or whether God was just static the whole time in space anyway. Like that, I think, is the ultimate important mission of our time, is with the exponential growth of tech and all this chaos that's going on. If we're going to get through this as a culture, it's like what Jung said. There's this great quote. I'm going to write a movie, and I'm going to start the movie with this little clip that he says, "Man is the great danger, and he's pitifully unaware of it." And he says that we need more psychology. We need to understand man, because, we are the origin of all coming evil. And it's true. And I think we can't surpass that without an idea or some kind of consensus to stop having that discussion and to move forward in it,
Mm-hmm.
So to me, infinity is a way to arrive at that. At least it's the way that I've been able to reconcile that, because I was a material reductionist for the longest time, right? Like I was a full-on, no woo-woo, very hard-nosed atheist kind of guy, and then things changed, and so I'm not sure if that answers it. I mean, it's very elaborate, but it
What
must
I kind
answer
of
your
heard you
question.
saying is that infinity is the name you give to a transcending, synthesizing, unifying function. Something that,
Mm.
wherever you have a pair of opposites that seem so contradictory that they couldn't come together, infinity is what you call it when they do come together, or how they come together, or something like that.
Yeah, well, infinity is yeah. I mean, you've said it perfectly. To me, that's how I would say it. Yeah.
It's very interesting.
It kind of reminds me as well of Leibniz. He considered the monad to be a zero, and he considered the universe or existence to be comprised of infinite monads, so it'd be infinite zeros,
Mm-hmm.
con- uh, becoming a one or God.
Yep.
The
Yeah.
ultimate infinite sum.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah. That's something I lightly dabbled into. Yeah, Leibniz's monad, and that is pretty much my worldview. Yeah. Like what you just said there, I need to write that down actually, because that's the very eloquent short form to explain what I believe in the most clean fashion.